So looking at hunger here in the United States, typically, again, it's the ability of people to obtain sufficient food for their household. When we think about hunger in the U.S., when in terms of coping strategies, typically a person who is exhibiting some form of food insecurity will do something like skip a meal, cut back on quality or quantity of food that they purchase, or have some sort of behavior similar to those in thinking of their food insecurity. This might happen because of a recurring or involuntary lack of access to food that can lead to malnutrition building over time, or it can be in a short period, maybe in a job transition period. When you have a family that's in a hunger situation, they might do something. For example, a friend of mine, when they were a little kid, they grew up in a single parent home with 6 kids, and what they would do in the mornings to make milk last a long time is that whoever got up first got to eat their cereal with milk in it, and then every child that ate after that just had to use the same bowl of milk and just pour their cereal. And so they were reusing the milk throughout each bowl of cereal. So my friend would always joke and say that that's why they are a morning person, because they would get up early to try to not have to drink the milk after their siblings. But this is a very clear example of a coping mechanism. So the parent knew this is important for my child's brain and bone development for them to get access to this milk. I can't continually buy enough to support 6 children, but I can get them to share this food among themselves so that everybody can at least have some of it. So that's a very, very common coping mechanism and a sample of what a single parent would do in that situation. Hunger generally, again, here in the United States is less severe than what you'd find in a developing country, but that doesn't mean that the problem doesn't exist here. In the U.S., you'll remember from the previous unit, I mentioned people tend to be geographically isolated. I showed you guys a map of the United States and mentioned the Black Belt region that spreads from the eastern seaboard all the way down and through Texas. And that tends to be a high concentration of the hungry poor here in the United States. We also talked through some socioeconomic factors that affect the hungry here and the demographic factors, focusing on minorities and groups that are particularly susceptible to being hungry. When we talk or to being food insecure, just to paint a picture and give you a local example of hunger, here in the Auburn area, the United Methodist Church has a food pantry that they started in 2001, and their first visitor, was served in September of 2000. Most of their visitors are female and represent a family of the female plus 2.5 kids, which generally means 2 to 3 children. So this paints a picture of a single parent household, mostly led by single women. And in 2001, the AUMC food pantry served almost 400 families with an average of about 18 visitors per week. And over the course of 8 years, that grew to in 2009, they served over 2,000 families with an average of 85 visitors per week. So I think this slide paints a pretty good picture of not only the increase in the number of people being served, but it paints also a picture of the type of people being served. Also, in the 8-year period from 2001 to 2009, they increased the amount of food per family that was given. So they went from 50 pounds to about an average of about 79 or 80 pounds that each family was receiving. At the food pantry, they only allow visitors to come 4 times a year. So you can imagine a family in a circumstance where they're having to utilize an emergency food source like a food pantry, but only being able to come 4 times a year. That you can very clearly and easily see that this visit, or 80 pounds of food times 4, isn't going to sustain a family of 2.5 people for an entire year. And so families within this situation that are having to rely on these sources are needing to kind of get to multiple places at multiple times. And it's very common at the food pantry, if you visit, to see people coming from very remote rural areas into our town of Auburn to take advantage of these services. And the women that run the food pantry often joke because they'll, have a car that's full of people that'll come, and each person representing a different family, and each person also trying to get 80 pounds of food in a car that's already full of people. And they joke about how they try to fit everybody in like a clown car with the food that they're able to take with them. But oftentimes the families are doing that ride share because maybe only one person in the local community has access to a vehicle, and they're having to get from a really far remote area of our state into Auburn for that food service. So the problem gets compounded by not only where the hungry poor live in our community, but also in their ability to access the food resources available to them. Oftentimes you'll hear Professor Coots or I say something called a food desert. And this is a region or an area that exists without access to adequate food sources. So that means that the community might have a gas station that has snacks here or there, but the nearest grocery store might be a Walmart that's 25 to 30 minutes away. So obviously if you don't have a car to get to a Walmart that takes you 25 minutes to drive to, you're not going to go very often, and when you do go, your resources are going to be quite limited. When we look at here in the U.S., again, drawing up the idea that food insecurity is tied to poverty, this is also linked to things like unemployment, inability to find adequate housing and meet other basic needs. When a family or a child grows up in a food insecure situation, they tend to exhibit higher levels of stress. And this manifests itself in behavioral problems at school. The children are more likely to drop out of school. So you're building up a population of children who are undereducated, who, while they were in school, were more focused on trying to get food than on learning. So even the education that they're exposed to, they don't even get fully what they were able to be exposed to. And so you're creating a population that is going to contribute to that intergenerational cycle of hunger and poverty that we've been talking about this entire course, where the child who's hungry can't get the education they need to get out of this situation, and then in turn puts their family right back into the problem. Other causes, if there's a place that exists that doesn't have affordable housing, people are having to make decisions between buying a house or getting food. Lack of education that I just mentioned also affects one's employment skills. And in a time like the economic recession that we're currently in, that started in 2008 and the U.S. is slowly digging itself out of, the people that are undereducated or uneducated and have limited employment skills or limited employable skills, those are the first to be affected by something like a recession, and also the ones to be affected the longest by a recession. We also have the idea that there's insufficient community food resources. This not only refers to food deserts, but it also refers to insufficient provision for emergency food services. So for example, here in Auburn, most of our emergency food services service not only Lee County, where our town is located, but some of the surrounding counties, because the counties around us aren't able to provide the services for their population. There's also a reluctance in the United States for people to accept charity. So they might see it as a stigma or something that they don't want to participate in, because maybe people will think less of them and they don't want to be perceived as getting a handout or something like that. And so there's also a lot of social pressures in accepting the emergency food services. You also have a high prevalence of mental illness, depression, and loneliness that grows in food insecure populations. Depression is common because the individual is isolated. For example, at the food pantry, the AUMC food pantry that I mentioned, when they first started the food pantry, They actually identified an elderly woman in our community who is relying on eating cat food that a neighbor brought over for her pet. That was the food that the woman was actually eating for herself because she was so isolated that the cat food was the only food source that she could find. And so identifying people that are isolated in our community is quite difficult, but also those people have compounded issues that contribute to them being as isolated as they are. You also see coping strategies such as dependence on alcoholism or drug use that might be a coping mechanism someone would adopt if they are put in these insecure situations. These alcoholism and prolific drug use can also be the precursor to creating a food insecure situation. So these two things kind of go hand in hand and are very common to find in a similar situation. We've mentioned before some federal and state nutrition programs that help provide safety nets for people in this condition, and they are primarily targeted towards women and children because those tend to be the most vulnerable people groups. I'm not going to go through bullet by bullet, but I wanted to just bring in and remind you of these programs. But in this lecture, I'm really trying to paint the picture that the people and the participants in these programs, I want to paint a picture for you of the linkages to poverty, but also the linkages to groups that tend to be underserved, and that women and children tend to be the most vulnerable here in the United States, but then you'll see throughout the course of this unit that they tend to be also the most vulnerable populations internationally as well. But the main idea that I want to convey to you and what I want you to be able to walk away from this lecture and understand is that hunger and poverty are intimately linked. You don't really ever find one without the other, and that to understand hunger, you really need to understand poverty and what types of situations people are living in to begin understanding how hunger plays a role in that situation.